Our speaker this evening is well known to us. He is Barry Newman, and Barry is a retired intensive care consultant, and this is his fourth talk for Dorset Humanists. His last one was on assisted dying, and tonight he's going to talk to us, or with us rather, about the philosophy of science. What is it? Does science really exist? How can we trust anything that scientists say to us? And things like that. So will you please give Barry a big round of applause?
Fourth talk. It's becoming a habit, isn't it? I lost count. Okay. First of all, well, a few opening statements. I don't profess to be an expert at anything. I'm aware that there are people in this audience who've got far deeper, broader training in science, pure science, than I have. So what I'd like to do is not deliver a lecture, because I'm not here to deliver a lecture, not the way I see it, but to generate a discussion. So at any point, if anybody wants to raise a hand to make a contribution, to challenge something that I've said, to add something, please feel free. Try and make it succinct if you can, because I've got a bit to get through. But I don't want to talk for half an hour and then have a discussion. I'd prefer it to be a conversation. Okay? So if anything comes up, just let me know. Why bother with the subject, particularly in this environment, in this group, humanists? Well, it's partly because, A, it's interesting, obviously, but more importantly, that we profess not to believe in deities and religions, but to believe in logic and science and empiricism and so on. That's fine, but we need to recognize that it's not an ideal or perfect way of gaining knowledge about the universe. And we need to be skeptical and insightful about the limitations of what we believe in. So that's really what largely stimulated me to look into the subject and land up here this evening. So I'm going to, there are just headers really on the slides, they're not going to be too taxing. I've got crib notes here, there's a thick pile, but don't worry, it's double spaced. It's not all that much. I am going to refer to my crib notes because I'm getting to the age where I can't keep the whole thing in my head at once. So let's kick off and ask.
In case you want that, there is a little clicker as well, or you can use it on the.
What do I do here? Just sort of that kind of thing. All right, that's can master that. Okay. So, philosophy of science sounds a bit intimidating. Perhaps not a very, very good title. Perhaps what is science is better. But. And what I offer here is not chapter and verse, it's just an opinion. It's one way of looking at things, I'm sure you can add to it. But what is science? It's an exercise that endeavors to gain knowledge about the universe in order to explain the universe. Why should we bother to explain it? Well, we're human, we just ask a lot of questions, that's why we've landed up where we are. Predict future events, because that's very useful. We always want to know what's going to happen. It's part of our condition. But more than that, we don't only want to know what's going to happen if, but we want to be able to control what happens if. So this element of control is often left out, but it's a very important part of the scientific exercise. It's not just a gathering of information. It's a gathering of information to do stuff. To progress science, scientists, all of us, use principles and tools, guiding principles and some tools. But the catch is that they're not perfect, and therefore the product is imperfect. And that's what I think we need to understand, its imperfections. So I'm going to kick off with something that looks a bit intimidating, or certainly intimidating to me, and that's logic. I don't know if any of you have ever tried to read into logic. It's extremely intimidating. Well, I found it so. But it's unavoidable. It's unavoidable. So I'm just going to skim over the surface and tell you what I know, because we can't make much progress without it. three basic forms of what's called propositional logic. There are other schools of. Abductive reasoning, inductive reasoning, and deductive reasoning. Sadly, they all sound about the same, but you've got to tease them apart. Abductive reasoning was actually only defined or described quite recently. We're talking about a chap called Charles Peirce, like 1839 to 1914. You know, you'd think this would go back to the ancient Greeks, but this particular, recognizing this particular kind of reasoning and defining it and exploring it is quite a recent thing. It provides the simplest and most likely conclusion from a limited set of observations. That's the crucial thing. A limited set of observations. It's a best guess heuristic. A stab at trying to understand what's right from a small sample of experience. Apparently computer systems use this kind of logic process very, very frequently to use small data sets and come up with the next step. And it's very, very close to another entity in the philosophy of science called inference to best explanation. They're apparently different, but really you can't put a cigarette paper between them as far as I'm concerned. It's much the same thing. So we have this abductive reasoning, having a stab at getting an answer from a small set of experiences or data or observations. Then there's inductive reasoning. Inductive reasoning is what we pretty well do all the time. It's a way of arriving at probable conclusions, but not absolute conclusions. Inductive reasoning will go along the lines of, I've seen 12,000 white swans, therefore white swans are white. It's quite a large data set. It's not as big as 12 million, which would make the conclusion from the proposition swans are white stronger. But it's an example of gathering as much data as possible and then moving from a set of observations to a general rule. Now, philosophers of science would say, oh no, you've got it all wrong, it's much more complicated than that. But to me, it's really a case of collecting enough data and then making a generalization on that. The important thing is to realize that it's a generalization from a set of data. It is not pure truth. It may not apply everywhere in the universe or everywhere on Earth. It's a best guess based on a lot of information. Deductive reasoning is a different animal altogether. In deductive reasoning, you do land up with absolute truth, because the truth is buried in your starting position. So the classic example of deductive reasoning is all bachelors are unmarried. We've stated that as a fact. It doesn't have to be that, but that's the common example. It probably goes back to the 1930s or 40s where these things were straightforward. All bachelors are unmarried. John is a bachelor, therefore John is unmarried. There can be no doubt about that. It's an absolute statement. To say that that is not true is to create what's called a contradiction. A contradiction in philosophy is the most terrible crime. It's all right.
I'm sorry.
No, it's fine. You're all right? Okay. Yes. So, deductive reasoning produces absolute truth, but the truth is buried in the propositions that make it. All right? 1 and 1 makes 2. It can be nothing else. Another example of deductive reasoning applied to mathematics. Okay, all right. So much for that.
Can I just chip in quickly
Please.
on that one? Because you said that 1 and 1 plus 1 equals 2, and there can be no doubt about that. I'm just wondering why Bertrand Russell spent so much time trying to prove that in his book on maths. But
yes.
Anyway,
Bertrand Russell, as far as and I can't read it, it's just too deep,
Yeah.
but my understanding is that Russell and Whitehead, in their great book, tried to place mathematics on a philosophical, logical basis, and wrote a book in many volumes to do it. But the diagnosis at the end of it was they failed.
Yeah, yeah.
I don't know why they failed, and I don't know how you define failure, and it's too far from me, but the philosophy of mathematics is in a different altitude. I run out of oxygen up there.
Yeah, fair enough. Yeah. We're not expecting you to do that as well tonight.
Euclid might be a good example. As well.
Yes, Euclid. Yeah.
With Euclid's Elements, which
Yes.
did a similar thing.
Similar thing? Can you expand? That sounds interesting.
Not
Not if you don't want to.
So he tried to come up with a consistent set of rules for doing maths, and deduced a number of truths that would have to exist given those rules. And one of those things that he had to do was prove that 1 plus 1 equals 2.
Yeah, okay. Right, you can see why we don't want to go there. All right. So,
could I just chip in a little? Both of the examples you've given are what philosophers call analytic statements.
yes,
The premises are true by definition.
yes.
Do you have an example of synthetic statement?
Are you talking about Kant now?
Well, no, just anything in the empirical world that is an example of deductive reasoning.
Not off the top of my head, can you?
Okay. The structure of DNA is double helix. This is an example of DNA, therefore this is a double helix structure.
It's much the same as Bachelor's and John, then.
No, because the structure of DNA isn't determined by definition, it's determined by inquiry.
Okay.
But it can change also.
Well, in that case, that's an inductive reasoning.
We're getting lost already, and this is the second time. This is great.
That's all right.
You can see how difficult it is.
That's what Peter is describing is inductive reasoning, and it's what scientists normally use to get from observations to a law. Deductive reasoning doesn't appear in those sort of fields at all. It's deductive reasoning is going from a premise which actually may or may not be true to a conclusion which is dependent on the premise or the premises that
the conclusion can be untrue, but it's internally consistent.
It's that's right.
If the premise is true,
it's whether the premise.
But your example.
Well, I'm just saying, I think the example I gave is an example of deductive reasoning, not induction.
True or false?
That DNA has a double
helix. Then you define it. It's based on an observation.
No, it's a matter of the relationship between the premises and the conclusion, surely.
Well, the premise is...
the premise is false.
The premise is...
the premise is false because DNA does not necessarily have a helical structure. It so happens that all the DNA that has been observed so far is helical.
That's irrelevant. We're talking about logic, which is the structure of an argument.
Okay, now remember, just hang on a second. Remember I said I wanted to skate over logic because it's very, very deep and very slippery. Everybody has just now proven my point. I'm going to move on, otherwise we're going to go around in circles for a long time. Logic is fascinating, deep, and I'm no expert on it.
Maybe double the bar afterwards.
Yeah, absolutely. 1 over a pint for sure. But I'd like to hear what you have to say. Okay. Now, we've, in a nutshell, shown what the difference between inductive and deductive reasoning is. Now, moving on to this thing called a scientific method. It shouldn't have been this scientific method because this is just an interpretation of how most of science works most of the time. It's a process. It's a process that starts off with an observation or a set of observations. You see something, you measure something, you observe something. You record it. Perhaps you see it many times. The sun coming up in the morning. Happens quite a lot. Why? So it's followed by a question, why, what, how? How should have been in there. Perhaps not what, but how. At that point, you can diverge. A hypothesis is created. It is a creative process. A great deal has been written and thought about how hypotheses come to be, how an idea, an explanation is born in somebody's mind. It is a very creative process and it depends very much on the history of the person, of the culture, of the knowledge, They don't pop into existence entirely in a vacuum. They are a product of a process, but they tend to be a novel creation, all right? Based on the culture, the knowledge, the science up to that point. Sometimes the leaps are massive. I mean, Einstein, that's a very, very big leap into the future. But even Einstein and Newton would all agree that they were standing on the shoulders of giants, to quote Newton. That is, they just didn't do it in a vacuum. They were part of a process, part of a cultural progression. Okay. So this hypothesis is, or conjecture, another word for it used in logic, provides an explanation of the phenomenon observed. Now, at that point, this hypothesis can be testable or non-testable. If it's testable, we go down the path of a systematic testing process. If it's not testable, it hangs there like unicorns. I think this is due to unicorns. Whatever observation it is, I think it's due to unicorns. An untestable hypothesis. It's due to God. An untestable hypothesis. Okay? Now, those groups of untestable hypotheses have been deemed pseudoscience. Examples that have been given are Freudian psychoanalysis, where whatever you say, it can be squeezed into the hypothesis. The hypothesis can never be wrong. All right? Marxist theory, when the predictions don't come about, the proponents of Marxist theory will then alter the theory very slightly to make it fit what actually happened. Those are deemed not derogatory, but just as a definition to be pseudoscience. So let's go down the route of what we call proper science. The hypothesis then is tested usually by a set of experiments, or an experiment. This experimental technique is relatively rigid and needs to follow some specific rules if it's going to be accepted. And the rules include, not all of them, just 3, maintenance of rigorous skepticism. Why must you be skeptical? Because your senses can fool you, and you need a way of being as objective about your perceptions as possible. It's probably never possible to be purely objective, but you have to try and move away from subjective assessments. The other thing in scientific testing is excluding confounding variables. If you're trying to find the relationship between one thing and another, does X cause Y? You have to exclude all the other causes or influences on Y, such as A, B, C, D, E, and F. You have to somehow control for them or exclude them to refine the relationship between X and Y. Otherwise, you don't really know why is changing. All right? So for controlling for confounding variables is, in most scientific designs, really very challenging. It's what sucks up the money, usually, in the design process. Once you've done all that, you collect a lot of data, numbers. And at that point, the knowledge is transformed into a different domain. It goes into mathematics. You transform the knowledge into a domain of mathematics so that it can be processed by mathematical processes, statistics and other analytical processes, which in themselves are deductive. Right? Assuming the data you put in, what comes out is not negotiable because it goes through a scientific process. Now, the scientific processes, like various forms of statistics, people can choose different statistical tools and come out with different answers. But if once you've chosen one tool, it's a fairly deductive process. Okay. Then you transform your mathematical answer back into the real world. I think that this causes that with this degree of certainty. Now we're going to come to degrees of certainty in a moment. It's a tricky one. But that's a version of a scientific process. The transformation process into maths is quite interesting, but I'm not a mathematician, so I'm not going to go into that. the conclusion that's drawn out of it, so you transform back from mathematics into written language, often, not always, the conclusion attempts to answer the question, does the data support or refute the hypothesis? I thought that X causes Y. Does the data say yes, or does the data say no? That's roughly the outcome. A good theory is one that is deemed to have high descriptive and predictive power. The theory must conform to some principles which I'm going to come on to in a little more detail. One is the principle of uniformity of nature and the principle of non-contradiction. Shall I stop there for any questions? We've spoken about scientific method.
Yeah, you mentioned psychoanalysis and Marxism as being unscientific. Wouldn't that sort of apply to all political and economic systems, really?
Yes,
Yes.
because you can't test them.
Yeah.
You can't run the scenario 50 times and see what the outcomes are, put the outcomes into a statistical package and come out with a probability of X. No, you're quite right.
Okay.
Much of life is unscientific.
Right.
I don't know. Take issue with some of that.
Please do.
Freudian bit, yeah, it's untestable,
Yeah.
unscientific, it's purely clinically based.
Yes.
And these days, most psychologists have no interest in Freudianism whatsoever.
Yes.
But with Marxism, it's a slightly different thing because there are two elements to Marxism. There's the economics of capitalism, and then there's the futuristic
Yes. Prediction.
philosophy of communism.
Yes.
Now that bit, the latter, obviously hasn't appeared yet to have borne fruit.
Yes.
But a lot of modern day economists who
Yes.
are not socialist or communist
Yes.
use Marxism
Yes.
to analyse what's going on in the capitalist world now, and they find it very predictive indeed.
Yes. So
one
you're
could argue
talking
that
about
that side of Marxism is actually quite scientific,
Yeah.
in fact.
Well, when you say scientific, it fulfills certain criteria of science in that it is descriptive. The problem is prediction. It's described as a pseudoscience because it will not predict the future given the present, whereas other forms of science, physics, chemistry, do.
No, that's what I'm saying. That's what Marxism does.
It
Within
predicts.
a capitalist economy. It predicts very, very well.
Well,
Because
surely
what's happening
Marx's
now-
main prediction was falsified by the fact that communism arose in Russia, not in the most advanced industrial
No, we're not
economy,
talking about
which
it.
is what he predicted.
Yeah, you've not heard what I've said, or you didn't want to.
Right.
I think
So
I did.
the communism
Hang on a second.
bit, I'm talking about the economics. I'm talking about capitalist economics, which was the main part of Marx's work, particularly in Capital and other documents of his.
Well,
A lot of economists use it now because it is so predictive. What happens now within free market economies is exactly what Marx was writing about in the 1850s.
Well, that would have to be
Precisely.
demonstrated by evidence and argument, wouldn't it? I mean,
It is.
I'll take your word as a plausible hypothesis, but no more.
yeah, okay. I'd like to talk to you about that, but perhaps not now because we'll drift off from science into politics and economics, which is another interesting area. Right. I mentioned some principles which need to be applied if science is going to run. It's a bit like having four wheels in a car. With three it just doesn't go. So this is one of the wheels. The principle of the uniformity of nature, it's an assumption that we make. Is it a fair assumption? Science is based on the assumption that the same natural laws and processes that operate in our observations have always operated, will operate forever, and apply everywhere. So if you go to the farthest reaches of the universe and you go backwards or forwards millions or billions of years, you will find that the same laws of physics, chemistry will apply. We don't work on the basis that science applies just in our locality, our laws. We assume, and it's assumption, that our laws apply equally everywhere and at all times. But can we be sure? This principle is just an assumption based on prior observations. It's an inductive inference. Because it would appear to us that everything seems to happen the same way, everywhere and all the time, we infer that everything is going to happen the same way everywhere and all the time. But we are simply using prior experience to make a general rule. This is an inductive process. And one can imagine, to quote Hume, if one can imagine, just in one's imagination, that something else could happen, what you have is not pure knowledge, it's not absolute truth. It's just an assumption based on past experience. Okay? So there's the uniformity of nature which we cling on to very tightly, but it does have a shaky basis. There is also the principle of consilience, which is used extensively in science, which is, I think, a pretty useful tool. Evidence from multiple independent and unrelated sources, often using different and unrelated means of measurement, do not contradict and converge on strong solutions. The simple example I can offer of that is simply measuring something. If you measure something with a tape measure, or with ultrasound, or with laser, or with any other mode of measurement you can think of, and they all come to the same answer, you have what's called consilience. They support each other, and you are more confident that what you have is usable. That is, if you measure it in a different way, you won't get a different answer, which will make the measurement process useless. So the principle of consilience is a very powerful tool. Just as a quick aside, there is another use of the word consilience, and there's a book of that name, and a very interesting book it is too, by Edward Wilson, who believes that all of knowledge one day will be consilient, and that our explanations of everything will converge and be consilient. So he's talking about art will be understood, music, appreciation, politics, everything will be explicable on the basis of one unified consilient model. Hello.
Sorry, can you just say again what consilience means?
Consilience in this sense, I just divert, but what's on the slide basically means, at its simplest, if you measure something with different tools and you get the same answer, your confidence in that answer can go up. Right. If you just use it with a tape measure, you don't know if that tape measure has been shrunk, been stretched. If you measure it with ultrasound, you don't know if your measuring instruments have been calibrated or whether your basic principles are sound. But if you measure it with 4 or 5 different things and you get exactly the same answer, and this has happened repeatedly in science, then your confidence in that measurement goes up, and if your confidence in the hypothesis will go up.
Thank you.
Yes?
Is this where the importance of meta-analyses come in science? So,
yes.
Yeah, so you've got loads of people around the world investigating the same
Yes.
thing, doing their own little studies,
Yes.
and then you're like, how do I make sense of all of this data? And they're
Absolutely.
using different measuring tools, and it's
Yes.
all a bit messy. So you do a meta-analysis, and you try to find some resemblance between those things, or something that, some consilience.
Absolutely, it's a very nice example. Meta-analysis is an attempt to create consilience. The hurdles with meta-analysis that I'm aware of are that people looking at an issue in very different ways, it's sometimes very, very difficult to bring that data together and make it equivalent. I mean, in the meta-analysis that I recall reading, many of them, in the first paragraphs, it will say, these were our criteria for entry, and we had to discard 95%. Out of 120 studies, you land up with 4 that pass strict tests of quality and similarity. So it is a very, very sharp and severe tool, meta-analysis. It's a good thing too. There's a lot of garbage out there, as you well know. Okay.
That's an interesting claim you've just made. There's a lot of garbage out there. Maybe we could come back to that at some point.
All right, very briefly. My background's in medicine, but I'm sure any scientific field is the same. People publish to stay in a job. Journals publish to make money.
So are you saying that...
I've published rubbish.
In
my career, a lot of good.
Are these all peer-reviewed things that get published and it's still rubbish?
Yes.
Yes.
Because a lot of research and the publication industry is exactly that. It is an industry.
That's the most interesting thing you've said so far, to me anyway.
Oh, you mustn't believe that science is some kind of pure ideological expert.
I don't, but
people have to pay their rent.
I don't, but you know, lots of people do sort of put their faith in
Well, we
science.
can talk about that in a while.
Yeah, okay.
The faith we put in science.
If somebody did a meta-study, but they wanted to produce a particular result, could they not just select only studies to look at that agree with them?
Yes,
So-
absolutely. You can do that right throughout life. You can you can open a newspaper and select the information that supports your view. That's a very human thing. The point about meta-analyses is, the good ones, is that they set entry criteria very, very strictly, and there's an attempt to make it objective. But yes, you can do it very subjectively, and that's what bedevils all of science, really, all of human inquiry.
Can I just make an observation?
Please.
When you say that a lot of the stuff out there is rubbish, I think one of the biggest problems we have in current society is that it isn't peer-reviewed, and they state things on the news or in discussion that then are deemed to be true when they've not been verified and tested through scientific methods.
Fact-checked to start.
Exactly, which is why meta-analysis is so important.
Yeah, but you can only meta-analyze things if you've actually transformed them into the domain of mathematics. If they are analog and not digital, if they're analog, they're just opinion. It's your opinion against mine. How do you measure the strength of your view against mine? That's the problem with non-scientific exploits, which is why humanists are so attached to science, I think, for myself. Okay.
How different is it when we don't talk from opinion or hypothesis, but from experience?
Yeah. Experience is unreliable. That's the truth of the matter. Both you and I can both experience the same thing and express completely different recollections of it.
Yes, we know that in terms of traffic accidents, witness statements, whatever.
Absolutely, yes.
Yes. So what any of us see and whatever we are interpreting.
Yes.
And that
is what scientists try to move away from and make huge efforts to do so. And that's what the method is all about, and recognizing the flaws of the principles. I'll carry on. Here's another favorite principle of mine. Occam. When was Occam?
Razor.
Yes, Occam and his razor.
14th century?
1243 to 1289, yes. William of Occam, I don't know where Occam is.
It's in Surrey, I think.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, there you go. Just round the corner. Pluritas non est ponenda sine necessitate. That's about as much Latin as I know. Which is variously translated into plurality should not be posited without necessity, or entity should not be multiplied beyond necessity. Occam. It's a heuristic principle, it's a sort of instinctive, if you like, principle, that conceptual economy, or I like this phrase, theoretical parsimony. That's a really nice one, very poetic. In applied to science, it means, basically, that simplicity is considered to be a virtue of theory, and it's almost axiomatic, in other words, a truth in itself, that simpler theories are better than complex ones. As long as they're consistent with the data, and they're coherent and don't contradict each other. So, why is it that this process of paring things away to get to a better truth seems to hold true most of the time? Here I've got a quote from Albert Einstein. The supreme goal of all theory is to make the irreducible basic elements as simple and as few as possible without having to surrender the adequate representation of a single datum of experience. Make it as simple as possible, but don't undermine any particular data, because if you do, you undermine the whole edifice. Okay. So, why is this view justified, this Occam and his ideas? By the way, it goes back way before Occam, back to the Greeks, this idea of simplicity. But his name is just attached to it. So there are three that I found justifications for holding Occam to be valuable. Not true, but valuable. One is logical. Complex models are affected by increasing statistical noise because there's a degree of uncertainty in every element. If an idea consists of 3 points and they all got a small amount of error, the total error put together, which is not just the sum of the three, but it's greater than the sum of the three by a mathematical calculation, will be of a certain size. If you make the number of factors 10 or 12 or 15, and you have a degree of uncertainty of each of them, the degree of uncertainty of the whole idea then becomes very, very much greater, and the idea less valuable. So that simply keeping the number of elements down to a minimum makes it mathematically more sound. So that's a simple logical defense of parsimony. Of, what did I say? Parsimony? I can't remember it. Theoretical parsimony, that's right. I must remember that. Then there is a second feature, positive feature of Occam, which I don't understand. And it would be interesting to hear your views on it, and that is the aesthetic or emotional response to simplicity. Now, I don't know how many of you are scientists in any shape or form, or even not scientists, but believe me when I tell you that when you don't know something and somebody offers you a complex explanation and a simple one, you are very, very drawn to the beauty and the purity of the simple one. It just rings bells. I don't know anybody, I do know a few awkward people who like complexity, but they are not the rule, okay? So there is this beauty. It's described, a simple theory is often in scientific literature described as compact, elegant, economical, and beautiful. Scientists will use this phrase, it is a beautiful theory, which is, I feel it to be true, but I don't know why. Okay? Can science be beautiful? The third justification for Occam comes from Karl Popper. Now we're going to come back to Karl Popper and his falsification business, but all I would say is that simple theories are more attractive because they are more testable and more prone to falsification. If they are prone to falsification, but this attempt to falsify them persistently fails, then the theory is held to be strong. Okay? So 3 reasons for Occam to be attractive. 1 is logical, 2 is aesthetic, and 3 is because Popper likes them. And he's a big figure in the field. But the theory doesn't go unscathed. Criticisms of the simplicity of science theory, simplicity, is that there's really no objective or rational reason why simple things should be better than complicated ones. And there are some theories that are very, very complicated. Quantum, about which I know nothing, except that it's very complicated, seems to hold true. We use it all the time. It's highly predictive, it's very robust, it's in all these little devices that we use, but it's very complicated. And it doesn't fulfill this idea of simplicity and beauty. Right.
Harry?
Does it not?
Sorry?
I wasn't aware that it do that. I thought that quantum physics, as I understand it, is actually coming back to really being very simple, that everything is energy, and that and coming back to very basic levels.
Okay. I'll buy that because I know nothing about it.
But it does have uncertainty built into it with Heisenberg's uncertainty. So there's certain things you can't know. Like
Well, there's nothing wrong with that, is there?
Well, okay.
We're talking about simplicity,
Yeah,
not
okay.
uncertainty.
Yeah.
But I agree. I'm going to come back to the uncertainty of life
But
in
I
general.
thought quantum physics is really it's simple in the sense that everything is, Einstein said, everything is energy.
Yeah.
And that therefore everything that happens or everything is a vibration of that energy, and that we are responsible in a way for our own vibrations and what is happening around us.
Okay.
Isn't the
Hang on,
response...
before you.
pardon.
Yeah, go on, just punch it.
Phil
Phil was first. Phil was first. I'll adjudicate.
Pope, please. No Pope.
Committee members, please behave.
Phil.
Sorry. What I was going to say was, if you apply Occam's principle to quantum mechanics, what you get, or to general relativity or something like that,
Yeah.
is of the simplest explanation. It just happens to be very complex. It's still the simplest explanation. It fits all the data.
Out of all
so
the
it's-
explanations,
so it doesn't matter
it is
that-
the simplest.
That's
but
right. You can't make a more simple explanation. That's all Occam is
Yet.
saying.
I
And
always
if you
put
could
the
make a
word
more,
yet.
well, yes,
At the end
I
of
think
every
so.
single statement. I've learned to do that.
As part of my work in cryptography, I've learned a bit about quantum physics, so I can learn how quantum computers
Yes.
might work. And I can't claim to be a quantum physicist, but I know enough about it to know that we would definitely need a real quantum physicist to actually explain it to us. It's not simple at all. It is actually very complex.
Who was it? One of the famous scientists said that there are very few people actually understand it.
Feynman.
Richard
Feynman, Richard Feynman.
Feynman,
Yeah.
that's right. Yeah.
There's,
yeah.
There's I think it's Dunning-Kruger effect, the one where after you learn a bit about something, you think you're an expert in it, and then you learn
Here
a
I
bit,
stand.
and then you and then you learn a bit more, and then you
You realise how little you know.
yes,
Yeah.
that,
I think I've come to that stage in my life that I realise how little.
It is a very difficult one. You did mention though about how all of our devices use quantum. We don't have quantum computers yet in our pockets. Although I suppose quantum physics is involved in that there's electricity moving around, and quantum physics is part of
I meant
physics.
it in a very vague
But,
sense.
yeah.
Yes.
I was thinking about this, and I wonder whether the usefulness of Occam's
Sorry, can you shout a bit?
Oh, sorry. I was wondering whether the usefulness of Occam's
Yes.
razor is more a matter of scale. So if you're designing an experiment
Yes.
and you're testing a hypothesis which is based on a theory, you need that to be simple.
Yes.
So that you can have a sort of A/B design to the
Yes.
experiment, and you've got, a variable that you're testing and trying to test cause and effect.
Yeah.
So you can't take into account all of the other aspects.
That's
of
right. You have to
science.
control for them.
You have to control for them.
Yes.
So it's very useful when it comes to those simple
Yes.
experiments.
But Occam applies to
Yeah.
theories rather than to design. The reason why you need simple design is because you're trying to create a causal link between one thing and another, and you want to exclude everything else.
Yeah.
I think Occam applies to theories, explanations, simple explanations and complicated explanations. But you're right, you have to simplify in experiment, otherwise you just don't get data that's usable, believable, plausible. Right, I'm going to charge on. We had this little interesting conversation right at the beginning about induction. I think we're going to have to revisit it somehow. One of the biggest, if not the biggest, issue in the philosophy of science and epistemology, which is the philosophy of how you know anything, is this issue of induction. And it's been around for a very long time, in Western philosophy, certainly back to the Greeks. But it's called Hume's problem in a way, because he wrote extensively and very famously about the problem. So the problem one of the aspects of the problem of induction is called Hume's problem. And in a nutshell, it states that we cannot apply a conclusion about a particular set of observations to a more general set of observations because circumstances are imaginable. I've been here before. Imaginable, where the premises may be false. So to use Occam and cut this down to a very simple explanation, you see 1,000 white swans, you see 10,000 white swans, and then you come across a black one. And you say, the vast majority of swans are white, but there is a black one.
You
Occasionally.
say it's not a black swan, it's not a swan.
Yeah. Well, hang on. All right, the bird that looks like a swan. But can you imagine a purple swan with red flashing lights? The purple swan with red flashing lights. Can you just imagine it? Well, you can. I can. And I'm not that imaginative. Right. So what Hume is saying is that because you can imagine the possibility of a purple swan with red flashing lights, it is possible that somewhere in the universe this thing exists. And therefore induction cannot give you an absolute answer. You cannot say that there is in existence no purple swan with flashing red lights. You cannot say that. So he was saying, how do you know something for sure? Well, you can't, is what he was saying. Certainly by induction you cannot. And we said by deduction you can, because the truth is buried in the premise. But here, the premise is all swans are either black or white. May not be true. Okay. So the use of inductive reasoning to establish truth cannot be rationally justified. By truth we mean something that is 100% correct, no ifs or buts. This is because deduction presupposes the uniformity of nature, because we just see black and white swan-like birds on Earth. It doesn't mean that 10 million light years away there isn't a purple one with a red light. And the uniformity of nature relies itself on induction, just our own experience. So induction, to Hume, was a circular argument. So one must be very careful when we say, well, there's experiments that show X. They show it to a degree. We'll come on to various responses to this problem of induction. I'm going to go over these relatively quickly because each one is complex in itself and my knowledge of them is not all that deep, but I'm keen to hear what you have to say afterwards. So there's a group of philosophers, now who were they? Doesn't matter who they were, they're just names. Logical empiricists, relatively recent, last century, who tried to set up a rational, logical process by which you can quantify induction and calculate the certainty of knowing something through induction. Another approach is simply to say, well, you can't know certainty. By the way, just a word about certainty about something. When you talk about the certainty of something, you often express it, for instance, in a percentage. Okay? If something is going to, if you're 80% sure that something's going to happen, is it going to happen, is that event going to be an 80% event, or is it going to happen 80% of the time?
Sorry, what's the difference?
80% of event means that 4/5 of it has happened, but 1/5 hasn't. So if you have an 80% chance of rain tomorrow, are you going to get 80% of the rain you expect, or is there an 8% chance that it's going to rain? In other words,
was it going to rain over 80% of Britain, but not the other 20%?
No, it doesn't mean that at all. Are you standing there going to expect 80% of the rainfall? Or are you going to experience 100% of the rainfall, but there was an 20% chance that you would experience zero rainfall? Okay, so that is a slight philosophical problem.
I think this is actually something where you have to ask the Met Office to define what they mean.
Yeah.
It could
well, I
be
know
either.
what they mean. They mean that there's...
Do you?
Yes.
But they could mean either.
Oh, I'm making a reasonable...
You're making a reasonable guess, yes.
No, because being rained on 80%, it doesn't exist in real life.
You get like...
You're either rained on or you're not rained on.
Yes, yeah.
You get rained on a little bit.
You know,
yeah.
It's not that 80% of you gets wet and 20% stays dry.
Yes.
That's what I mean.
Oh, right. So, it's a clear question. In that particular thing,
it takes a bit of
process. But I mean, it's actually, there is another explanation of that it might rain for the full hour, or it might just rain for 80% of the hour.
Ah.
When they say there's an 80% chance of rain this afternoon,
Yes.
it is actually, you know,
But
it's got
they
several
don't
possible...
tell you whether it's going to rain for the full hour. They give you the chance of it raining within that hour. It could be 3 drops. It's rained.
It's actually the chance that it rained in the previous hour.
Oh, really?
Oh,
That's what they say. They say so. If you put a little if you put like a little pot there, the chance that it rained
So it's
at 3 o'clock. It's not saying the chance of rain at 3 o'clock. It's saying that if you looked at that pot at 3 o'clock, the chance of there being rain in that landed in that in the previous hour. Because I looked at it the other day because I didn't know the answer.
Oh, okay.
right.
Yeah.
Well, there you go. You see, it is not. It's not. This probability thing is not straightforward.
That should be
Is this what's
should have been for 2 o'clock in that case.
yes.
Probabilities,
Yeah.
because that's what I
Yeah,
recognise.
that's reform about.
Whether it has rained in the last hour, we want to know it's going to rain in the next hour.
Right.
Yeah.
So we have the idea that from induction you can extract a probability of something being true, but the concept of probability itself is problematic. That's the point. Okay. So inference to best explanation we've been through already. So a response to Hume's problem is it's not really a problem. We can approximate based on data. This one, induction as a standard, is interesting. Strawson is another, I think he might still be alive, living or recently living philosopher, who said, this problem of induction that everybody's been cracking their brains about for 2,000 years or so or more, is not a problem at all. Because induction is the tool with which we experience the universe. And his example is, if you measure something in kilograms, that is what you measure things in. It's no good questioning how much a kilogram weighs, what the philosophical weight of a kilogram is, because that is the measure of weight. We define a meter. These days it's defined in the number of wavelengths of a particular wavelength of the emissions from something specific. Anyway, it's the number of wavelengths. If you measure length in that number of wavelengths, it's no good saying, well, I'm not too sure what a wavelength is. It's what you use, okay? It's no good questioning the length of a foot. It is a foot. So his point is, don't stress about this. Induction is the tool that we use. There isn't another one. Live with it. I rather like that, because there isn't anything else. All the other options do your head in. Okay. And then we get to falsifiability. Now, I need to find out where I am in my notes. I don't want to get lost. Here we go. Right. Oh, there was a sentence here that I was trying to dredge out of my deteriorating memory, and I found it. Let's talk, just moving back slightly towards probability. A theory cannot be 67% correct, but it can have a 67% a 67% chance of being 100% correct. Yeah?
Yeah.
That's what I was trying to dredge up, and I looked vague a minute ago. All right. Okay. Just going back to probability, because I lost my place, and I shouldn't have. Probability. Some of you might know about Bayesian probability or Bayesian equations or theory, which is probably how our brains work, but that's another story. The Bayesian approach to probability goes something like this. You get a piece of data, or 2 pieces of data, and you say, I think the chances of the cause of this are so and so. A minute later, you get another piece of data, and you recalculate in your mind, automatically, heuristically, the probability. You get another piece of data and you recalculate it again. And every time you get a new piece of data, the probability changes because your experience is being enriched. Now, that's a sort of subject of analog way of doing it. Bayes puts it into mathematics, which even I can understand, which is saying something. So there is a logical, mathematical way of adjusting probability for every new experience or piece of data. The two are the same thing. Piece of data and experience are the same thing. So there are ways of responding to Hume, but the underlying premise that you can't know anything for absolute sure, I think, does hold. Popper. We must get on to Popper. But apparently not now. I'll come back to that, because falsifiability is very important, but it doesn't follow right. Oh, it does too. Oh, in which case my notes are started. Excuse me, let me just.
You've just lost the place.
Come back to the beginning.
That's not difficult.
That's it.
Yeah. Now, Popper is a very, very famous, recently deceased philosopher who made a huge impact on this kind of problem, this problem of induction. He agreed with Hume that it was not possible to prove that something is absolutely correct by inductive reasoning, which is what I've been banging about for the last half hour, but due to the limitations of supporting data. But he did claim, and still does claim posthumously, that it is possible to disprove something deductively, absolutely. So if you have a theory, and all the data that you receive, your entire experience supports that theory, okay? All you need is one experience where the data does not support the theory, and the theory is dead. Yeah? If you drop a brick on your foot 35 times and you have exactly the same effect, or 35,000 times, or 35 million times, and the next time the brick does that, all your understanding of gravity, of relativity, of the reasons why that brick hit your foot are out the window, according to Popper. Now, there are caveats. You know, there might have been an earthquake. Your foot might have moved. There are other factors that can come in. But his basic idea was, don't fret about induction. All you have to use is deductive logic. That is, if there's an item of data that disproves your theory is wrong. Absolutely wrong. 100% wrong. Not a bit wrong, but absolutely wrong. So that he got to a deductive conclusion. And he claimed that the purpose of scientific process is to refute our hypothesis, so avoiding the need for proof by induction. He just took induction and chucked it out and said, all you have to do is disprove something. That's all you have to do. The problem is that's not how scientists work. They don't set out to disprove things directly. They set out to prove things.
But should they set out to disprove?
It can be useful.
Well, there's an interesting point. I mean, our brains don't work that way. We look for justifications. We don't look for reasons to disbelieve something. We look for reasons to believe things. It may be something to do with the human mind. But, and Popper, of course, has been roundly criticized by a lot of people. One of the criticisms being that science just doesn't seem to work like that. But if you take any experiment and you say, underneath all this inductive logic to prove it, all that's really happening is that we're looking at the data, and there's a good chance that it'll be disproven. I have to say, as an aside, is that negative findings, that is an experiment that finds that A does not influence B, a negative finding, is almost always rejected by the journals because it doesn't make interesting reading. I have personal experience of spending 6-9 months doing studies that came out with very valuable negative findings. I couldn't get them published.
Isn't that a huge part of science? It fails most of the time.
Yes.
And in fact, I remember, this is speaking to the null hypothesis. You learn what it is by what it isn't.
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. Yes. Perhaps you can explain what the null hypothesis is?
I just remember it from years ago at university.
Okay.
effectively you learn what it is by proving that it's not. It's
yes.
difficult
So it's
to
the
explain.
construction. It's the construction of an experiment designed to show that something doesn't work. You set the experiment up to show that A does not influence B. And if you fail, and if you continue to fail, doing experiment after experiment, then the confidence in your hypothesis grows. Because it's quite easy to show that A does something to B, but it's showing that it doesn't is the hard bit. Generally people don't approach science like that.
Field.
Pardon?
That field of negativity is too large. It's infinite.
Yes, or putting it another way, people are uncomfortable with disproving things and tend to want to prove things.
Yeah. But I wanted to go back one on what you said, and I'm sorry, my brain's got sort of got
No, John,
overstretched. But it was coming back to this thing about belief and reason. Because again, faith is, as a philosopher I was taught, faith is belief without reason.
I'll go
And
with that.
so if you have the faith, then all these things of science, it's a total, I can't say contradiction, but that what you can produce by faith will never be produced by science.
Yes, because faith is not based on.
But yet you can produce through faith things,
So
and the scientists can never prove it.
You can't prove it, but you can disprove it. If you can provide no data to support it, you can say it's disproven.
And someone says they've had an experience, or that is their experience. Nobody else can gainsay that.
You can.
You
But-
can't
but-
say
but-
that I haven't experienced what I know.
If it's not a general experience that can be measured, analysed, transformed into data and transformed back into the real world, then it's just a subjective experience. I could say that I just saw a unicorn walk down that corridor.
Yeah.
You can't gainsay me, but
Yeah.
it's not science. It's just an experience.
But then you're missing out a lot, aren't you?
I don't think so, but the rest of disagree. I don't miss unicorns. Sorry, we had.
There's more to than unicorns.
Yeah, well, just a couple of small points. There's a foundation which offers, I think it's like $1 million as a reward.
Yes, it's
for,
the Templeton Foundation.
Yes, that's the one. And they say that if you can prove a paranormal experience or phenomena in the world, and they agree with you on what the test should be, then they'll give you $1 million, and it's never been won.
Well, people have won it and they've had to give it back.
Oh,
Really?
Because their experiments were found to be false.
oh. The other.
Templeton was a Christian who set up a foundation to try and incorporate science into Christianity.
Oh.
And they give a prize for the scientists who basically prove scientifically that religion works. I'll tell you a quick one. They funded the study of the power of prayer to cure cancer. They took people with various forms of cancer in some of the northern states of America and got people, not surprisingly, along the Bible Belt in the south to pray for them. And they constructed this in a scientific way so that the people in the south didn't know the people in the north and so on and so forth. And it didn't work. The outcomes for those that had prayer and those that had placebo were exactly the same. But because it was a non-scientific exploit, there were lots of ifs and buts. We should have known their names, then we would have been able to name them in prayer. And that
It
kind
only
of thing.
works if you believe.
Pardon?
It only works if you believe. They often say is a
Yeah.
reason why it fails.
Yeah.
Can I just say, I think Dan, actually, there's a miscommunication there, because I think you were talking about the James Randi Institute,
Oh.
which is different. It was different. You're right about the Templeton,
Yeah.
but where you said about disproving the thing, I think
Yeah,
that was James Randi. It's a different thing.
I don't know
it's-
that one.
I don't
Yeah.
think it is
yeah,
the Templeton
I-
one.
James who?
James Randi.
Oh,
You know,
right.
he's a
R-A-N-D-I.
real skeptic. He died a couple of years ago now, didn't he?
He did
It was-
he did shows in Las Vegas and stuff.
Yeah,
where
he was a
don't-
magician, but a
Yeah.
skeptic, and he managed to. There's certain frauds like Peter Popoff, who used to walk around with a mic speaking to the dead and all this stuff like that. And he exposed all these people. But the James Randi Institute, that's what they did. They put a £1 million prize up, and it sat there for years. And anyone who could go through, it had to be proper scientific criteria.
Yes.
And there's £1 million waiting for it, but no one ever claimed it because actually when.
Yeah, well,
it's crap, really.
Your word, not mine.
There was another brief point I was going to mention,
yes,
which is that I've heard that some scientists who have a hypothesis and then prove quite well that they were wrong choose not to publish their research, partly because of the embarrassment of having a wrong hypothesis and because they feel that their work is less important because it didn't come up with useful results. But it would be useful if they published it, because then no one else will make the same mistake and waste their time.
You make a very good point that I'm going to come back to, and that is that scientists are human beings with all the flaws and foibles of human beings, and that was part of my interpretation of Thomas Kuhn's work, which I've got a slide on right at the end, and I hope I get there. Okay. The other thing that Popper lent his mind to, which is quite widely quoted, is this business of the demarcation problem of science. What is science and what is not science? It's a big question, okay? We talk about science, but we don't really know where to put the boundary. Well, he tried to do that. This is a quote, and I'm just going to read it, it's simpler than me rambling. Scientific theories regularly disagree with accepted views based on common sense or previous theories. That's okay. Something new comes along and it disagrees with what you think you've seen or other explanations. Something new. These theories make bold, counterintuitive claims about the nature of reality. I mean, space-time? Probability in quantum? That's not intuitive, okay? However, so too do mythological and metaphysical theories. That unicorn is equally mysterious. That is also a postulate that is counterintuitive and world-changing. Just imagine if one did walk into this room. It would turn our worlds upside down and everything we understand. So he's saying that a scientific theory and a mythological or metaphysical theory have the same qualities. So how do you divide them up? Where do you put the boundary around science? How is scientific knowledge to be demarcated from myths and metaphysics? And the way you do it is through his tool of falsifiability. Only things that can be falsified, theoretically, qualify as science. Something that cannot be falsified is pseudoscience. It is not science. It is not open to rigorous investigation. There's no possibility of showing that it's not true. So, a belief, I can say this here because I'm among friends, a belief in God is a mythological, metaphysical theory. God is a metaphysical, mythological concept. It cannot be disproven. If you believe it as your subjective experience, it's true. It's true to you, but it ain't science, that's his point. It's only science if it can theoretically be disproven. It's a useful tool, I find. And that was, I think, one of Popper's, to me, one of his most powerful contributions, is this business of demarcating science, saying what it is and what it isn't. Because people who are skeptical of science, as an exercise, will often quote, well, I believe in so-and-so, how can you prove it's not true? Here's the tool. So we've been talking about induction a great deal, and how it's good and how it isn't good, and how science depends on it, and how we use it every day, every minute of our lives, taking some data, creating a theory in our minds, and getting on with life. But the philosophers don't like induction at all. They think it's a highly flawed tool.
Absolutely.
So, induction is the glory of science and the scandal of philosophy is a lovely quote.
Is that a real quotation?
Yeah.
Who said it?
I'll have to go and look it up.
Because it seems bizarre to me how induction can be the glory of science. I'd have thought everything that Popper and other people of a similar ilk have argued is that induction is a false route in science. Sorry?
They're philosophers, not scientists.
Okay, well, I've heard Richard Feynman talk about falsification in glowing terms, and that's not induction, is it?
Yes, but when he's talking about falsification in glowing terms, I think he's talking about the demarcation aspect of falsification. That falsification demarcates science from non-science.
Okay, I mean, induction is a logical fallacy.
Yes.
You're drawing a general conclusion from particular premises.
Absolutely.
And
yet, when I say it's the glory of science, as a tool, it has delivered all of this.
But it delivers hypotheses, but then they need to be tested.
Yeah, but remember at the very beginning, the hypotheses are tested, but the hypotheses also allow you to alter the future. They are powerful enough for you not only to predict, but to manipulate the future.
But we can create those hypotheses at any given point in time.
But they have to be
power,
tested.
Yes, but the
it's a creative process.
The power of the human brain and psyche is that we have those innate powers.
Absolutely.
If we use them.
Yeah.
So we can at any time change the course of our destinies or whatever.
Only if science only if the known universe allows it. So you may wish to change the universe by bringing into creation a unicorn, but you can't.
No, what I'm not suggesting that, but I'm suggesting that if you are aligned with the purposes of the universe, you can bring about.
Okay, we may be on a slightly different strand.
It was Charles
The comment about the glory of science is a comment about what science has produced by using induction. It's a glorious tool, but it worries philosophers deeply. And one can see why. You know, it's a bit like having a slightly blunt axe. It knocks the tree down every time. It's not 100% sharp. That's sort of off the cuff metaphor. Off the cuff metaphor.
The quotation is by C.D. Broad, who was a philosopher.
Excellent. Thank you very much.
We both just looked it up.
In 12 seconds, nobody in this room will remember that.
There's another flaw that should have come earlier in the talk. I'm not sure why it's landed up at the end here. And this was a causal fallacy. Now, this is another interesting one to ponder, and I am nearly at the end. Causality is an essential way that we understand the world. I press this button, that thing is going to flash. Cause and effect. Once again, I drop a brick on my foot, I feel pain. Cause and effect. What we're really talking about there is that something usually follows something else. We're just talking about a sequence, an association. Yes? We're talking about something that always follows, as far as we know, something else. But does it mean that it actually caused it? The word cause is troublesome, very troublesome. Okay? What we're really experiencing is just a sequence of events that we've previously experienced. We are conflating association, regular association, persistent association, with causation. So what do we mean when we say X caused Y? So I'm an ex-doctor, so I'll give you a kind of medical take on this. We're back to the, I don't know why I like this metaphor, but the brick on the foot. I haven't dropped a brick on my foot recently.
I dropped a jar of coconut oil
All right,
and I nearly broke my toe. So
stick to a brick.
I know about
I don't have many jars of coconut oil at home. I have a few bricks. You drop a brick on your foot, it hurts. Cause and effect. Yes. Now what was the cause? Was the cause gravity, making the brick fall? Or was it warped space-time, making the brick accelerate in that direction? It hit your foot. It first hit your shoe, which compressed your sock, which compressed your foot, which caused some tissue damage, which released some chemicals, which caused nervous impulses to go up your leg along your sensory nerve to your spinal cord, relayed then up to part of your brain, relayed then up to a further part of your brain, where you, this thing called you, your conscious self, registered this thing, this emotion, the subjective experience, caused pain. Which step was the causation?
The whole process.
That's an easy answer. Thank you for the easy answer, but you get the idea. Yes.
Yeah.
Once you drill down into a sequence of events, it's very, very difficult, or perhaps impossible, to say this caused that.
With your clumsiness.
Undoubtedly.
Yes.
Sliperiness of the brick.
I'll take that. Okay.
Yes.
So here we have the causal fallacy, where something follows something else, but in fact it's part of a long, long train of events. I mean, we can go back to the history of that brick when it was clay. Did the clay cause the pain? Because the clay became the brick, and so on and so forth. We can go back forever to the Big Bang, I suppose. I said that I would talk a little bit about Thomas Kuhn because he's popular, and everybody knows something about him. And he has become quite popular in the postmodernist era. Yes, but he has been very badly misinterpreted because he meant very little of what postmodernists hold. But we'll just jump that a bit. Kuhn was a scientist. I think he was a chemist, and he drifted off into philosophy. And he wrote a book, Scientific Revolutions. The something of Scientific Revolutions, of which I've read about 2/3 and got so hacked off I had to stop reading it. He gave what's called a historiographic view of science, a sort of retrospective sociological historical analysis of where science has been and therefore where it's going to be. Pseudoscience, I suppose. How it seems to go over time. He described 2 phases of science in his view. Normal science, where the scientific community accepts a set of ideas, laws, rules, assumptions, a package, which he called a paradigm, which probably his greatest contribution to the English language is that the use of that word paradigm. We all use it all the time. And they work within that paradigm. They agree with everything and they explore its boundaries and fill in the gaps. And that he called normal science. Okay? Expanding and developing the ideas to fit the observations. That was his point. We find things that fit our preconceived ideas in that paradigm. We enrich the paradigm, but we don't punch out of it at all. Okay? The paradigm is sustained by scientists in a community and therefore a product of the society in which it's practiced. So for him, science was a sociological entity. It was a group of people agreeing with each other, not breaking any rules, and progressing things by filling in gaps. And perhaps filling in gaps in such a way that they fitted the paradigm because it's too uncomfortable or too difficult or beyond their imagination to get out of it. Okay, so they're living in this paradigm bubble. Along comes a revolution, and he made similarities with political revolutions. A new paradigm comes along. Somebody comes along with a clean idea, and obviously, Einstein is the obvious example, but there are others. Evolution and DNA and replication of DNA and the placing of selection on a chemical basis would have been a paradigm shift. So a new paradigm is made. It doesn't share any concepts of the old paradigm, it's sitting there out by itself. Scientists in the 2 paradigms, according to Kuhn, can't even communicate with each other because they don't even speak the same language. They speak past each other. I find it fanciful, but I'm just telling you what he wrote. The new paradigm cannot be proven or disproven by the rules of the previous. I have a little bit more to flesh out there because right. Yes, so he drew similarities between scientific revolutions and political revolutions, in that scientific revolutions present a choice between 2 incompatible modes of thought, and adopting a new mode demands the destruction of the old. He took quite an extreme view. Okay? He claimed that scientists in different paradigms did not have a shared set of concepts, vocabulary, methods, and that the different paradigms were described by him as incommensurable. Very long word, but you get the drift. In that the new paradigm cannot be proven or disproven by the rules of the previous. Right, he's got a point. I mean, can you explain relativity using Newtonian physics? That's a paradigm shift. But does one cause the destruction of the other? And can a scientist in one who's been trained in Newtonian physics not comprehend what's happening in relativity? I'm not so sure. Okay, scientists from differing paradigms would be incapable of communicating or understanding each other. They would be talking past each other. And a paradigm is sustained by consensus within a community, and that the science is a product of the society in which it's practiced, which I've put up there. So, there's the popular myth that Cohen was suggesting that scientific knowledge is a subjective sociological phenomenon. And you can see how people have extracted that conclusion from what he said. He certainly went on record and said, I really didn't mean that. But people have interpreted or embroidered Cohen's work to say, well, you know, if you're an Aborigine down doing walkabout in the middle of Australia, and you believe that the earth is held up by a tortoise, or is that Terry Pratchett? I'm not sure. And then the tortoise is on the elephant, so I'm never sure if the elephant's on the tortoise. I've got to read that book again. But if that's your paradigm, within your society, that's true. That's truth. And postmodernist view is that it has extrapolated that to say that if within your society, if you believe something, that is true for you, that is truth. This, of course, flies in the face of what we've been talking about, which is some attempt at objectivity. He vigorously later denied this interpretation of his work and qualified in any of his ideas. And he was very much criticized by a large body of contemporaneous academics, but he claimed that they had misinterpreted his ideas, which is the usual riposte among philosophers. You disagree with me? You just don't understand. Yeah? They all said that at some stage. And my question really is, and that's the end of it, unless you want me to talk about the full governing body meeting that I somehow stapled to this. Did Kuhn really caricature science, or did he make a useful contribution? And that question I will end.
Thank you.
Or rather open the discussion.
Yeah, can I just ask, you've made a kind of, obviously, comparison between subjective experience and objective experience, and you obviously gave a very extreme example of, say, of a truth of, say, Aboriginals thinking the world may be suspended on a tortoise. But could I just kind of see what you think about, like, I don't know, just general day-to-day living, say, like, because somebody mentioned, you know, psychologists and stuff, and most psychologists nowadays probably don't necessarily see it as a science as such, because so much of people's life is a subjective experience. If you say one person doing a job, for instance, he might be very depressed, whereas another person might see that as an opportunity to do something different in their life, sort of thing. So, you know, a counsellor or a therapist would see that as their subjective experience. I mean, you wouldn't be sort of suggesting that that would be pseudoscience and not worth the time of day, because it isn't objective, would you?
I'm not saying that every human activity that is useful has to be a scientific. Definitely not. You know, you can provide assistance and help to somebody in an emotional way, in a way that you might describe as emotional. It doesn't diminish its value, but it doesn't make it science either, and it doesn't strive towards or make any progress towards understanding the absolute truth of the universe. Now, we will never get there. I don't think that we have the capacity, unless we build computers that are much more cognitively advanced than we are. We're unlikely to get a really objective view. We don't really know what the universe is. We only have our eyes, this piffling little brain, ears that take in noise. Our sampling of the universe is very, very limited, and our ability to analyze it is very, very limited. Are we ever going to comprehend absolute truth? Almost certainly not. But what the hell, it's still quite good being alive. Yeah, so when you talk about science producing truth, I think science pursues truth. It definitely does. And it does make some progress, because you're going to get out and get into a car and go on an aeroplane and switch on a light, and, you know, science has made a lot of progress into understanding and harnessing the universe. But understanding it absolutely? No.
So we're still dealing with subjective experience pretty much all the time.
Yes. Except that, and I don't want to go there, but there is, I can't remember his name now because I don't remember names, but there is a scientist, there's a philosopher who has presented the concept that the entire universe can be reduced to mathematics. Everything.
Was that Pythagoras or
Max Tegmark.
Max Tegmark, thank you. Yes.
But Pythagoras
Now,
is much the same.
Yes, Pythagoras, I think, was very mystically mathematical.
Yeah.
Their mathematics was close to religion.
Yeah.
So they did believe, I think, that the universe could be understood, interpreted, reduced, depends on the point of view, to mathematical statements. Yeah. So, I don't know, it's beyond my pay grade.
Yeah, no, I was just saying, just understanding where you were sort of defining it.
No, I'm not diminishing non-scientific endeavours. I'm just saying there are some things, and for us humanists here, I think science has a very, very special place for us, because we've rejected, I think it's fair to say, a non-scientific explanation of life. And I guess we try and replace it with something else. It's imperfect. And I think the point of the talk, if I would say what's the one point I'm trying to make, is that science is very powerful, but flawed. It's incomplete.
Can I please ask?
Sorry, there's a lady at the back with her hand up for a long time.
Sorry.
All right. I'm trying to think of a solution to this problem, because at the moment it seems like you're almost going from, you know, normal science is speaking English, and then suddenly you have a revolution
Yes.
and everyone's speaking Cantonese.
Yes.
So it's complete different set of grammar as well
Yes.
as different symbols for things.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering whether progress in science is that radical, and I'm wondering whether you keep the same meta rules about how science should be conducted, or like the best way to find out about the world, but the content of what you find out about,
Yes.
and the sort of assumptions about what exists and what causes what change, but you're still agreeing on the methodology. So
Okay, so yeah, 2 points there, and that's a very, very lovely contribution. 2 points there. The meta rules, as you call them, is the process. It's our logic and how we use that logic to construct activities, let's call them, to test truth. The other point, sorry, you were saying that, I've just slipped out of my mind. There were 2 things. You said the rule, oh yes, the other thing is changes. Now there's no doubt that science is a journey that stutters. It slows down for a long time, then it speeds up. It slows down and it speeds up. You know, you have the Ptolemaic system of the universe with the Earth in the middle, and then you have a revolution with the sun in the middle. Then you have further revolutions. Well, I don't want to call them revolutions. You have certain lurches, leaps, okay, of understanding. He put them all in separate packages and saying that's one paradigm, that's another paradigm, they don't talk to each other. Whereas most scientists see continuity with lurches. That's my model.
Completely different topic. Where do you see the life sciences? Are they science at all?
What do you mean by life sciences? You have to be a bit more specific.
Biology, ecology, well, what I call natural history.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so
Medicine.
Medicine.
Well, it's
Well,
just
yeah,
glorified
yeah.
biology, really.
Yes.
I'm afraid.
But they're not falsifiable generally.
Yes, they are.
Are they?
Yes, well, you can have a theory that you can test and falsify. I've done it.
But at the practical level, are they? You give a patient a drug, he has a bad reaction. You don't say that. You always find an explanation.
Well, let's just be more general about this. You have an observation, an illness, okay? You have a hypothesis as to why it's happening and what you can do to influence it. And you take 100 patients and you give them that, and you give 100 patients something else, and you see, is there a statistically significant effect in those? You could be doing it with electrons in a laboratory. I think there's this situation, if I do that, something will happen there. I'm going to do that 100 times, and I'm going to do it 100 times with something else.
The penny's just dropped. With physics, it's not a matter of statistics,
Oh, it is.
Oh, is it?
Well, anything is, because there's error in every measurement, so you have to apply statistics.
Okay, yeah.
Results are rarely binary. An individual result might be binary, but a whole set of results is going to have a statistical spread, because there are random elements. Controlling for confounding influences, as we call them, is usually imperfect. I mean, for instance, to do some experiments, you have to exclude gravity. How do you do that? You go up to space. Because you can't exclude those extraneous... We're talking about experiments on a micro level, where the slightest tremors of the earth, air, everything, will mess your result up. So you have to go somewhere else to do it. So that's how difficult it can be to construct the experiment.
But then
When you're doing it on...
to normal existence.
Yes, it does, because you're simply doing a pretty mundane test, but you're doing it in an environment where you can say, I'm pretty sure that gravity didn't affect this experiment. Therefore, the relationship between X and Y is due to something else. We can take gravity and put it away. So yes, it's just...
So you're eliminating one factor.
You're eliminating one important and difficult confounding variable. Something that can confound your test, mess it up, basically.
But so, leaving that particular one aside, if you go back to the life science thing, you're saying you've got a drug, which is, it's been rigorously tested, and you know that on a certain percentage of times it will be successful, and a certain percentage of times it won't. So if you give it to a patient and he is unlucky, that doesn't actually alter your belief that the drug is good. That the drug does what it says on the box.
You have to define a lot of terms there. Good.
Well, yeah, I know that.
Good can mean a lot of things. Good can mean, for the vast majority of patients, the benefits outweigh the risks. That's good. Or you can say, the risks are quite high, but this drug can actually do something quite extreme, like save a life. So you can give dangerous drugs, but if the circumstances are such that they're warranted, but we're going into medicine. I don't want to do that.
No.
I retired from
okay. Well, I was actually thinking of sort of herbicides and things like that.
It's well, this is not science. This is simply balance of benefit and harm.
Yeah.
Nothing you do is 100% perfectly beneficial, virtuous. There's always going to be a downside. Every coin's got two sides. You do things on the basis of the balance of benefit and harm. Everything.
Yeah.
You take risks. You fly in an aeroplane on the basis of the balance between what you get out of flying, getting somewhere, and the risks of getting a deep vein thrombosis, eating lousy food, becoming claustrophobic, and possibly being in a crash. You don't think about it consciously, but you're just making that calculation. We've drifted off science, haven't we?
We have, yes.
Yeah, I heard people, well, quite often, say the problem with logic is the only tool we've got to check logic is logic itself. So basically, it's just all completely circular. And then they normally come up with some crap, I'm going to use that word again, you know, but they tend to, and they say, well, yeah, but you're using a circular thing, our truth's outside of that. Do you think does that make any sense to you at all, or is it a problem that you use logic to check logic?
Look, as I said, I think we are imperfect. We're not infinitely clever. We have this tool called logic. It makes a lot of sense to us. It's useful to us. Is it absolutely perfect? You'd have to ask somebody from another planetary system and that. I don't know. Another life form. Perhaps if we could ask bumblebees if they thought we were logical, they might have a different idea. I have no idea. I'm just trapped in being a human.
Yeah.
So are you, I think.
Yeah.
Unless you're something else.
Well, I've got the wine now.
We've got time for maybe the two more hands that went up.
Sure.
So Adrian and Dan. Should we go to Dan first?
Yes. Do you think that there's ever a problem of people believing that their ideas are scientific and correct because they think of themselves as a sceptical person, even though they might not have applied a process to arrive at those beliefs that is actually scientific? Maybe because they've read some sciencey books and they've learned what the scientific method is and they've just assumed that now they are a science person, or maybe they are actually a scientist in one area, but they believe that makes them an expert in every other area, even though they're not really one.
Yeah, just the foibles of humanity. Look, science is hard. Doing science well is very, very hard. I listen habitually to a podcast called The Life Scientific, which interviews a lot of very, very good scientists, and you get an impression of the years and years, sometimes decades of slog before they achieved something. I've just tasted that. Okay, I've done some studies that have run 6, 9, 12, 18 months. It's hard work. Yes, there are people who have a smattering of things and regard themselves as experts. I probably do it all the time. I'm probably doing it tonight. There's one question up there. Last one.
Yes, I just wanted to make a comment about theories and their ability to explain observations or otherwise. There was once a famous psychologist called B.F. Skinner, you may have heard of.
Yes.
His primary interest was the control of behaviour.
Yeah, behaviour therapy.
It was his view that theories are a waste of time. You don't need any theories to explain anything. All you need is observation and measurement. And if you observe something, then you can make predictions and say, you do A, after A, B will follow, or whatever it is. You don't need a theory to explain why B follows A.
And my riposte is, he would say that, he's a psychologist, he's not a scientist.
And mine would be, he's a scientist still.
Yeah. Anyway.
Well, I'll just allow Jeremy, because you haven't had a chance, Jeremy. It seems you've had lots of chances. But Jeremy, go ahead, Jeremy.
Yeah. Okay, fine. Barry, it's a most interesting talk, and you show great patience and tact, I think, in answering a whole variety of questions from different people. So congratulations in that regard.
Thank you.
I just wanted to ask you one last thing, and I don't want to take up too much time on this. How would you distinguish, because you have been using these two terms on and off during your talk, how would you distinguish between observation and experience?
I don't.
You don't? You don't think they're related at all?
No, there's no difference between them. They're synonyms.
That's what I meant.
They're synonyms.
Exactly, they're synonyms. Because at one stage in your talk, you seem to almost trash experience. Whereas
unqualified, unskeptical experience. When I say a trash, I understand what you mean now.
Yeah.
Taking raw experience as fact, as truth, is flawed. Using experience to construct a process by which you can approach truth is a different matter. But you have to, those impressions that you get, that experience, has to be put through a machine of objectivity, of analysis, of skepticism.
A rigorous process, in other words.
It's a rigorous process. It's hard, it takes a lot of time, and it comes up with a result that's not true, but probably closer to the truth. That's all.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Barry, I still find this really difficult, and but it's just made me want to try again and maybe go back and read some of those books like Popper and Kuhn and all the rest of it. Some of them are waiting on my bookshelf, and I'm sort of not going anywhere near them.
Let them stay there.
Shall I just leave them? Shall I leave them? Okay. You've certainly stimulated lots of discussion, lots of thought. I hope we'll carry on in the bar afterwards if you would like some extra molecules of various things in the bar. So please give Barry another big round of applause.